watching this video because a sexually violent predator has moved into your area. The following information will be presented by the State of Colorado Community Notification Team. My name is Mark Slavsky. I'm a detective with the Wheat Ridge, Colorado Police Department.
My name is Debbie Sternholm. I'm with the Colorado Community Notification Team.
My name is Kathy Rodriguez, and I'm with the Sex Offender Management Board with the Colorado Department of Public Safety.
Today we will discuss purposes and intended benefits of community notification, a review of sex offender legislative history, an overview of community notification, general education information regarding sex offenders, victims, and sex offender management, community responsibility, community protection and safety issues, and at the conclusion of this video, you will hear about the subject of this community notification.
In the mid-90s, there were a set of federal laws that were established which really provide the foundation for Colorado laws regarding sex offenders and why you're watching this video. In 1994, the Jacob Wetterling Act was established. This act requires all states to establish a sex offender registration for all convicted sex offenders and a way to track them. In 1996, the Megan's Law was passed, and that law requires states to find a means of notifying community residents, when sex offenders are residing in your community. The Pam Lynchner Act of 1996 amended the Jacob Wetterling Act by providing lifetime supervision for some sex offenders, as well as a national sex offender registry. Colorado sex offender registration includes how to define what a sexually violent predator is, as well as sex offender registration laws, and a statute regarding community notification.
Community notification occurs two ways in the state of Colorado. Community members may visit their local law enforcement agency and review a list of all sex offenders that are registered in that community. Also, law enforcement comes to the community via a community meeting or this video to alert you to sexually violent predators that are registering in your area.
So you might ask, what is a sexually violent predator? First and foremost, you need to remember that this is a label given to identify the highest risk sex offender. It does not necessarily describe the sexual offense. Every state has a way of identifying the highest risk offender and separating that out from other sex offenders who may not be given that label. In Colorado, there are two ways to identify sexually violent predators. The first way is when the offender committed the crime in Colorado. The offender must be an adult, or if they were a juvenile, they must be tried as an adult. The crime must meet certain criteria, such as crime type, the commission date, and the date of conviction. Then that offender meets the criteria to be given an assessment, which is conducted by an approved treatment provider as well as a probation or a parole officer. If the offender meets the criteria of a sexually violent predator, then that probation or parole officer makes a recommendation to the court, who must make the actual finding. The second way a person can be identified as a sexually violent predator in Colorado is if that offender committed their crime and was convicted of that crime in a different state. Remember, all states have a way of identifying the highest risk offenders, but some states call them something different. If the label given to the offender from another state is equivalent to Colorado's label of sexually violent predator, then that offender is given the label of sexually violent predator in Colorado. By Colorado statute, all designated sexually violent predators are subject to community notification.
Community notification begins when the Department of Correction, Parole, Probation, or another state notifies local law enforcement that a sexually violent predator is arriving in that community. The sexually violent predator must register with the local law enforcement agency. That agency notifies the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and that agency also conducts a community notification in accordance with the Sex Offender Management Board criteria, as outlined in the Manual for Colorado Law Enforcement. Colorado Bureau of Investigation places the sexually violent predator on the internet within 3 days, and that site is at sor.state.co.us.
There are some important things that you should know about sex offenders and some misconceptions that may be out there. Some people believe that the majority of sex offenders are placed into prison. However, most of them are not even caught or detected. In fact, less than 16% of sex assaults are ever even reported to the authorities. Over 80% of sex crimes go unreported. In Colorado, research has shown that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 17 men have been sex assault victims in their lifetime. Some people believe that they can spot a sex offender. There really is no typical sex offender. However, it is important to remember that they all tend to be deceptive, manipulative, and secretive in the way in which that they commit their offenses. Some people also think that sex offenders have a long history of criminal behavior, when in fact many sex offenders have no criminal history. In addition, studies show that 75% of sex offenses are carefully planned. They are not acts of impulsiveness. With regards to sex offender characteristics, it's important to know that most sex offenders engage in what we call crossover behavior. This means that although an offender might be caught for one type of offense, this person is many times at high risk to commit another type of offense. Someone may be convicted of victimizing a victim of a certain age, but that doesn't mean that they're not at risk of harming someone of another age. Most sex offenders are male. Female offenders account for less than 10% of offenders. Crime of conviction is only one indicator of risk. Also, sexual deviancy typically begins in mid to late adolescence. This shouldn't be confused with juveniles who have committed sex offenses, in that they don't necessarily always become adult sex offenders. However, it's found that adults who have committed sex offenses typically began that behavior as teenagers. It's additionally significant to know that sex assaults do not necessarily occur in dangerous places. A study conducted in the Colorado Department of Corrections indicated that 85% of sex offenders reported having committed the sex crime at their own residence or at the victim's residence. In addition, most sex crimes are not committed by a stranger. Research has shown that 78 to 90% of sex offenses are committed by someone known to the victim.
It is a felony crime to have sex with someone who is under the influence of drugs or alcohol and who is physically incapable, unconscious, or incapable of appraising the nature of their own actions, according to Colorado law.
Although the person that you're going to be notified about today may or may not be under community supervision, we believe it's important for you to understand how Colorado supervises sex offenders. There is no cure for sex offenders. However, like any behavioral choice, they can learn new behaviors and skills. Consequently, some of them can be safely managed in the community. Most sex offenders in Colorado are supervised by the criminal justice system in the community. When someone is placed on probation, they have standard conditions that they must abide by. However, a sex offender who is on probation or parole has additional conditions that they must abide by and comply with. These conditions tend to be pretty intensive and rather lengthy. Some of them include waiving confidentiality and offense-specific treatment, as well as polygraph testing. Waiving confidentiality is important because of case management purposes and because secrecy really undermines rehabilitation efforts and threatens public safety. Sex offenders must be completely accountable for their behavior and agree to these intensive and intrusive measures in order to remain under community supervision. You'll see a triad model of the containment approach that is utilized in the state of Colorado. On the top is the criminal justice supervision. This is typically probation or parole. On the bottom left-hand corner is the sex offense-specific treatment. This is the therapist involved in court-ordered treatment for the sex offender. And on the bottom right, you'll see a polygraph examiner. Sex offenders who are granted supervision in the community are required to undergo polygraph examinations on a regular basis. You will also see to the side community members. That's because we believe that community members can be an integral part of this system by reporting anything suspicious or any wrongdoings to the authorities in an appropriate manner.
There are many myths about sex offenses. One myth is that most victims ask for it. Fact is, sex offenders use power and control to dominate and humiliate victims of both genders. Another myth is that victims who suffer no obvious physical injury are not seriously traumatized by their experience. That is not true at all. Only about 4% of rape victims sustain serious physical injuries as a result of rape. In fact, 70% reported no physical injuries at all. All victims suffer from the effects of being raped. The impact of victims of sex offenses are varied, and there is no norm. Victims may exhibit many different responses, including crying, anger, being quiet or withdrawn. Sexual assault by someone known to the victim creates even more difficult recovery processes. Victims often develop post-traumatic stress disorder, and long-term effects include anxiety, eating disorders, flashbacks, divorce, loss of sexual interest, loss of concentration, and sleeping disorders. Victims of sexual assault are 3 times more likely than the general population to suffer from depression, and are 13 times more likely to attempt suicide. They have greatly increased rates of substance use or abuse and a higher rate of unwanted pregnancy. And they also have an increased risk of involvement within the judicial system. One of the ways to combat that is to control the response and minimize it, which is done when the victims are supported and believed by their families and members of the community. The community has a vested interest in helping the offender be successfully managed within the community. Sex offenders have the same need for housing and employment as other citizens, and harassment is counterproductive to the goals of the community management and may cause the offender to go underground where they cannot be supervised at all. Sexually violent predators must register with the local law enforcement agency where they live. They must do that on a quarterly basis for the rest of their life. The law enforcement agency will verify each registration on a quarterly basis. And these offenders must register their email addresses and internet identifiers with the local law enforcement agencies. Sexually violent predators do not represent all dangerous sex offenders. A community notification process is not a complete deterrent to sexual assault. Remember that most offenders are not known to us because most offenses are not reported. Harassment, threats, intimidation of the offender is counterproductive to the best interests and safety of the community. We want them visible. We want them registered in the community. We do not want them underground. The harassment or threats to these people is criminal and will be investigated, and the actor will be subject to prosecution. There is no way to protect yourself in all situations, and the following tips and advice cannot completely eliminate the risk of sexual assault. However, they may provide you with information to prepare you for potential situations. Many people are concerned about what to tell their children about sexually violent predator that moved into their area. Avoid any scary details. Be honest and use language that is age appropriate. Teach your children not to harass or visit the offender's home or yard. Teach your children to tell safe adults if anyone acts inappropriately toward them, if they're too friendly, if they're threatening, if they're just acting creepy. Should pay close attention to your child's thoughts and feelings. Role play with your child. Act out scenarios of various dangerous situations and teach them how to respond. This gives them an ability to recognize it and not be surprised by what's happening. Teach them to avoid high-risk situations and be observant of their surroundings. Teach them to be thoughtful and to use good judgment when choosing their friends and partners. Teach them appropriate social behaviors. Teach them the correct names for body parts. And teach them that adults are not always right. And teach children the importance of honesty and the danger of keeping secrets. Thank you. In just a few moments, you will receive information about the sexually violent predator that has moved into your community and other information relevant to your neighborhood. Please take the time to view or copy the resources outlined on the next slide. And thank you again for your attention.